You are listening to Leading the Factory Forward with your host, Lynn Friest. We share interviews with manufacturing experts and strategies for embracing the digital future, recruiting a new workforce, finding new business. Lynn is an advanced manufacturing strategist and leadership consultant who is on a mission to show manufacturing leaders how to improve their current operations while preparing for a digital future. And here's your host, Lynn Friest.
Welcome back to Leading the Factory Forward. This podcast series is going to be on conversations, difficult conversations, effective meetings, and then we'll have a special episode on the book, 10 Powerful Things to Say to Your Kids. So in general, this is going to be about conversations, how work gets done in meetings, and also how do we have conversations at home. In this first episode, I'm going to share 4 key ideas that will improve your conversations as a leader and help you move your business ahead. The first idea is listening, and we're going to talk about what it takes to be a good listener as you prepare to have conversations. The second idea is being present. Again, how am I really being present as I have a conversation with someone? The third idea is creating a safe space. We want to make it okay for people to talk and share their ideas and their concerns and let us know what they need to know. And then finally, we'll talk about the 4 C's of an effective conversation. Many of the ideas come from a great teacher and a friend of mine for many years, Paul Axtell. And I will include links to his book, Meetings Matter, as well as links for some other authors and resources that have helped me on these subjects. Paul begins his book by saying the first step is for you to take a perspective and a mindset that your conversations and your meetings truly matter. He says, meetings are at the heart of an effective organization, and each meeting is an opportunity to clarify issues, set new directions, sharpen focus, create alignment, and move objectives forward. Another perspective on this comes from Deborah Tannen, who wrote several books. One of them was You Just Don't Understand. And she says every person's life is lived as a series of conversations. In other words, as I've said, and I think in emotional intelligence, think back on the last 5 conversations you've had with a person. Think about how that might set the context for your relationship with them. Or think back on the last 5 team meetings you've had, and what was that tone of those meetings? Again, how does that reflect on the effectiveness of your team going forward? So more in general, conversation is how work truly gets done. We can issue reports and data, but often it's the conversation that really moves things ahead. And also, as I said earlier, conversation is how we create relationships. How we work with our teams, it really boils down to the effectiveness of our conversations and our meetings. Sort of a context to put all this in perspective comes from Bernard Meltzer. He says, before you speak, ask yourself if what you are going to say is true, is kind, is necessary, and is helpful. If the answer is no, maybe what you are about to say should be left unsaid. Just another introductory perspective that try to remember that as a leader, your voice is, in a sense, louder than others. So maybe you should choose to speak last on some issues, or at least be conscious of the fact that your voice just may overwhelm the voices of others and they may not speak. The first thing we want to look at is the idea of just listening. So this is where you as a leader can begin to move your time and your energy from being the leader who is just speaking to the leader who is also listening. Why is it important? Well, in Brenda Euland's book, Strength to Your Sword Arm, she has an article called Tell Me More. And in that, she talks about how people deeply listen and the importance and the value can come from it. And she goes on to say, actually, leaders seem to lose their ability to listen as they either get higher levels of leadership or as they are leader a longer period of time. So again, be careful of the fact that as a leader, you could actually lose your ability to listen. Another thing from both ourselves and our team's perspective is conversation is how we make meetings for ourselves, how we really understand issues and how then we can go to work on them. And people often don't get a chance to speak out loud about a new initiative, a new program. When I worked at a manufacturing facility, I had the opportunity to be interacting with both factory manager staff and also the frontline staff. And while at the factory manager staff, they had great opportunity to talk about new initiatives and new programs. And really, each person got to speak to it and, in a sense, make it his own. As it cascaded down through the organization, the people on the front lines were lucky to see a PowerPoint on the issue and really had no opportunity to talk about it or understand it, at least in a formal setting. They can often try to understand it and talk about it informally, but Not surprisingly, their perspectives may be a little off from what is intended. So what are some of the things that when listening is missing can happen? I once was at a conference and had a leader from Shell Oil who was in the Netherlands say to me, Lynn, you people in the U.S. think that because you share the same language, you always understand each other. We at Shell know we have different languages and need to be clear and precise in our speaking. Again, how many times have we all been to meetings, each walking away with different understandings of what literally got said? Another thing about listening is we can sometimes just end up playing, rather than having a conversation, we end up playing verbal ping pong and trying to make our points and never really taking the time to understand theirs. So what are the first steps as far as developing your listening skills? Well, again, referring to Paul Axtell's work, he has a wonderful listening exercises he has often used, and it's pairing people up, and they're given a simple question. One person speaks first, and they have to speak on that question for 3 full minutes. The other person just listens, can't acknowledge or make any comments. They just listen to the person. And that actually is kind of an awkward thing at first when you first try it, because very seldom do any of us get to speak uninterrupted for 3 straight minutes. But if you go through a couple of iterations of that exercise, all of a sudden it becomes very interesting. So anyway, that's one way to start. The next 2 are just kind of mindsets to go into conversation with. One is to be curious. In other words, saying, I'm going to be curious about what the other person has to say. The second one is to be respectful. I want to at least respect the fact that this person has their opinions, whether I agree with them or not, and I will listen to them. And finally, going into conversation and going into your listening, focusing on understanding and not simply preparing to advocate your position at some later time. So again, focusing fully on trying to understand that other person. The second idea is being present. Well, it seems like a simple thing, but as all of us know in today's distracted world, we are not present, and neither are many other people sometimes. There was a wonderful story. I don't remember the source of it, but it was of a young girl. She was in the kitchen. Her mother was making dinner. She wanted to try to tell her mother something or explain something to her. Her mother was busy working around and saying, I'm listening, honey, I'm listening. Finally, the little girl jumped up on the stool, grabbed her mother's face in her hands and said, no, Mom, I want full face listening. And that always kind of stuck with me as a great example of, okay, am I giving the person I'm with full face listening? People know when we're not paying attention, and to some extent, they feel we're disrespecting them when we do that. We also can end up misunderstanding someone quite badly because we truly just haven't heard what they had to say. So what are some of the first steps we could take as far as improving being present? The first is obvious. Avoid distractions. Set down your phone, close up your laptop, any other types of things, turn away from the TV, whatever the things are that distract you and pull your attention away from the person, try to avoid those things. Another thing is, this comes from William Isaacs, who wrote the book Dialogue, The Art of Thinking Together, is he says, try not to be listening from history. We tend to fill in what we know, not what they say. In other words, if I'm only partially listening, I said, I know what they said because they said that a month ago. Well, they may actually be saying something different now. So try not to listen from history, but listen to what's currently being said. And finally, just focus on looking and listening intently to try to use everything in your senses to understand the speaker. Again, it's a matter of holding true focus on that person. The third thing is to create a safe space. So what is that? It's the opportunity for people to speak freely and without being judged or criticized. According to Google's research and Project Aristotle on high-performing teams, having a safe space to talk for teams is a key to being a high-performing team. Another reason it's important is everybody owns a piece of the truth. When the same event happens, I was in one position, literally, or in a different location, and so I understood it one way. Other people saw the same thing from a different perspective, in a different position. We need to know everybody's piece of the truth. And then also, in terms of safety, but be aware that people have different speaking styles and processes. Deborah Tannen, who wrote the book Speaking 9 to 5, Women and Men in the Workplace, she says, everything we say has meta-messages indicating how our words are to be interpreted. Is this a serious statement or a joke? Does it show annoyance or goodwill? Most of the time, meta-messages are communicated, interpreted without notice, because as far as anyone can tell, the speaker and the hearer agree on their meaning. But again, whether it be differences in gender or culture or language, be mindful of the fact that other people may have different speaking styles than you do. So again, when we don't have that safety, obviously people can be concerned about being judged, especially by their leaders. We can also, if we've in effect people are not speaking up, we may miss out on creative thinking that could really help us move ahead with new ideas. So what are some first steps you could try? You might ask, what have I missed at the end of the conversation? Could any of you tell me something more that I missed seeing? And then as you have conversations with an individual person, whether it be mentally or actually, try to be side by side with the person looking at the problem, not looking across the table at them and have the problem between you. In other words, be side by side, at least mentally, as you each examine the problem. Again, helps with that whole idea of safety. So the 4 C's of an effective conversation, again, come from Meetings Matter by Paul Axtell. So the first C is clarity. To be effective, everyone needs to have a common understanding of what got said or what was intended or the purpose of the meeting. So creating clarity. The second idea is candor. That goes back to the psychological safety, making it a safe place, but the idea that people can truly speak up and be heard. The third C is commitment. Again, in this conversation have you agreed to do something? Who's going to do what by when? Is there something there that's going to go forward? Even if it was just information, can the person repeat back to you what they heard you say, and is it the same as what you thought? So the whole idea of having commitment or some purpose going forward. And finally, completion. And this gets back to that idea, is there anything else that has to be said? Is there a need for a second conversation? But are we truly ready on both sides to close this conversation? And why is this all important? Our conversations are high-value events, and we don't want to waste our time or the other person's time by being ineffective in them. Being effective in conversation is crucial to moving the business forward, especially when we live in a fast-paced and disruptive world. We have to be clear and effective in our conversations. And sometimes there's a difference. We have to understand the difference between just data and how people feel. As an engineer, I often felt I could provide more data if people didn't understand or agree with me or whatever it might be. But a consultant once said, no, it's really what people are asking you for is, what about me? I feel concerned. How do my concerns addressed? I don't understand you, whatever it may be. So there's a whole idea of how do people feel at the end of your conversation. So what are a couple of first steps? The most obvious one, check for understanding as the conversation wraps up, or even during the steps of the conversation. Are they understanding the way you expected them to? Another thing is speak their language. I spent a lot of time as an engineer translating between engineer lingo, IT lingo, and the people on the front line of the manufacturing floor. As engineers or IT people, they had literally a kind of a different language. So the frontline people would hear what they said, but they never really understood it. So I would often spend a lot of my time in my career trying to act as a bit of a translator. So make sure in your communications, you're using the language that's used by the people you're speaking with. So that wraps up this episode. And in summary, the 4 key points we covered were developing your listening skills. We really want people to tell us more. We want to be present is the second one. We want to have full-face listening. We want to create a safe space, that information project Aristotle at Google. Finally, the fourth one, the 4 C's of an effective conversation. We want clarity, candor, commitment, and completion. So sort of a summary quote. Again, this is from Susan Scott, who wrote Fierce Conversations. Our work, our relationships, and our lives succeed or fail one conversation at a time. While no single conversation is guaranteed to transform a company, a relationship, or a life, any single conversation can. Speak and listen as if this is the most important conversation you will ever have with this person. It could be. Participate as if it matters. It does. So again, thank you for listening to this episode. Our next episode, the second one of this series, is going to be difficult conversations. So some of the topics we'll cover there is what's your mindset going into that conversation? What's the outcome you want to have out of a difficult conversation? Again, revisiting that, how to create a safe space, and next, designing that conversation. What are some ideas on how to actually design difficult conversations? And finally is, how do you complete a difficult conversation and then develop what's next after it? So again, I'd kind of like to close while we've given techniques and ideas for having conversation. So I'd like to close this episode with another quote. This is from Maya Angelou. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So again, just a thought to carry into your next conversations. We'll look forward to talking with you next time.